My name is Zanelda Rodriguez, and I'm so excited to really be sharing with you how to build a charrette that's particularly focused on IDEA strategic plans, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. A little bit about me, I have many dual roles and a lot of experience, particularly in urban planning. And this is going to be important to the story that we're going to share with you all today about how this IDEA charrette process and model emerged. I have about 20 years of urban planning experience in both rural, urban, and suburban environments, helping communities, elected officials, business owners, and residents really reimagine what their neighborhoods and communities can look like. I also have experience, particularly around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, and having served as a consultant in an organizational management consulting firm that provided IDEA strategic plans to various organizations across the United States and also globally. Currently, right now, I'm a senior associate with the Nishwain Group, which is a redevelopment and land use planning consulting firm. And I'm so excited to be here with my colleague and former partner, Corey Schneider. Corey?
Thank you, Zunilda. Hi, everybody. My name is Corey Schneider, and I do currently sit with Russell Reynolds in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion practice. I'm a longtime practitioner of diversity, equity, and inclusion, coming into this work through the lens of mental health and then education, and then have practiced across industry sectors with some of the consulting firms that I've worked with in the past. I am a newcomer to the methods of Charrette, but Zunilda completely convinced me that this was applicable and a really great vehicle in our work to help organizations very efficiently and quickly and succinctly develop diversity, equity, and inclusion organizational strategies for them. So I'm very grateful for Zunilda to have introduced me to the methods of Charrette and the application to our diversity, equity, and inclusion industry. So I'll pass it back over to you, Zunilda.
Thank you, Corey. So we want to kind of lay the groundwork of what the objective of this webinar is. Really, the core focus of what we're going to try to do here today is really share with you our experiences, best practices, and lessons learned about how to develop an inclusion, diversity, access, and equity strategic plan using the Charrette model as an approach from an adaptation perspective. Now, there's a lot of value in Charrette model. And so what we're going to really kind of showcase for you through our examples here today is that you can utilize the Charrette model to do a couple of different things. One, to align various organizational stakeholder groups across multiple levels inside of an organization to really get buy-in in terms of the development of an IDEA strategic plan. You can also create a process that really helps to create a human-centered design so that the strategic plan is not just something that lives on a shelf, but that actually is applicable and implementable by an organization. The Charrette model can also be a really great way to help foster ideation, solutioning, and even problem solving inside of an organization when it comes to the issues around inclusion, diversity, access, and equity. And then finally, it could be a great tool to cultivate really organic allyship across multiple stakeholders, both inside of the organization as well as externally. So first and foremost, many of you may be familiar with what charrettes are, perhaps not. So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about what charrettes are traditionally and how the idea of an IDEA charrette emerged. As I mentioned, part of this story really began with the idea and concept around me as an urban planner. Having spent a lot of years working with a variety of different stakeholders and communities, I oftentimes utilize the method of the traditional planning charrette, which is essentially an iterative process that can span anywhere between 3 to 5 days, where you bring multiple stakeholders from a variety of different areas to really solution, problem solve, and hopefully maybe gain consensus around a very tough issue that they want to create a solution around. That's really at the heart of what a charrette is. Now, given that was a concept that I was very familiar with as an urban planner, there came a time at about the end of 2018 where Corey and I were working on a number of different strategic plans for organizations. And during that time, we began to see a couple of gap areas. One particularly around the fact that as we were developing strategic plans for organizations, we found that there wasn't really a lot of stakeholder engagement. They were being driven at the most highest levels of the organization, oftentimes by executives and their VPs or maybe their leadership team, but that's about it. It didn't go much further than that when it came to engagement. Another thing that we quickly saw was that the strategic plans that we were developing were taking a very long time. And so it could go from anywhere between 6 months to maybe even 2 years to develop a strategic plan, particularly focused around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And we began to think to ourselves, wow, it'd be really great if we could do this in a much shorter time frame, but still be of high quality. And then the third thing that we began to notice was that there was an appearance of a lack or an absence of a lot of data-informed decision-making that was happening as part of the development of the strategic plan. We didn't want plans that were just good on paper, but we wanted plans that could actually be implemented by the organization. And we wanted to make sure that they had the appropriate level of data in order to do that. And so given that these kind of questions were emerging for us, we said to ourselves, wow, is there another way, another path? And I have to admit, Corey challenged me one day and said, do you have any ideas? And I said, actually, I think I do. It actually stems from a model that I used to use quite a bit as an urban planner called a planning charrette. That's when the idea of doing an idea charrette began to form and take shape. So as subsequently the process began, I began to develop an actual concept proposal. And I began to think about, and you could just flip back a little bit, Corey, to the previous slide. Thank you. I began to really think to myself, okay, as this charrette concept is going to take place and we're going to develop what it could look like, I was very familiar with urban planning charrettes, but how could I adapt it so that it could actually be utilized for the development of an idea strategic plan? And that's when I got in touch with the National Charrette Institute. I knew that they were pioneers in helping to train people all across the country on how to do traditional planning charrettes. And so I invited them to come in and to actually train other members of our team on what the charrette concept was in its traditional form, but I also invited them to help us kind of brainstorm at the very earliest and highest stages of what an idea charrette could look like. And we utilized the training in person to begin to do that. And so during our training session, we actually developed a lot of collateral and even the framework of what this could look like at a high level. Next slide. So as the concept of an idea charrette began to emerge, this was at the top of 2019, before the pandemic. And during this time, we began to really roadmap out how do we take various elements of what a traditional charrette encompass and apply it to organizations seeking to develop their own inclusion, diversity, equity, and access strategic plans. So as we began to develop that model, we actually were approached by a potential client who wanted to serve as a pilot as part of this process. So not only did we have a new concept in play, but we actually had an organizational client that was eager to develop their own idea strategic plan using this new model. And that is how the idea of an idea charrette began. We started in the middle of 2019 with a 3-person day charrette. And it was based off of the traditional concept of what most planning charrettes encompass: in person, lots of activity, host of different variety of people participating across multiple days. We built a number of different activities to encourage participation as part of the process, and built a very good and robust schedule to help our charrette participants from day 1, day 2, and day 3 participate in. We even created collateral materials to help guide them through the process. And we actually made sure that we, as a project team, were working hand in hand with them as part of this effort. The 3-day charrette with this client, which we'll talk about in a little while, was a success. In fact, we actually thought about creating a phase 2 to help support them with implementation of their idea strategic plan. This was at the top of 2020. And you can imagine there was a lot of momentum for this process with this client in this particular organization. But I think you all know where this story is going. This was the top of 2020. And behold, we could not envision what would happen in March of 2020. The pandemic hit, and it seemed like the whole world was turned upside down. Everything that we could think of, all the processes that we had put together as part of this pilot process, seemed to be at a crucial moment of fixedness, in part because The entire world, it seemed, and particularly massive amounts of organizations were going remote, no longer doing in-person work or activities, no longer creating multiple day conferences, training sessions with hundreds and thousands of people participating, but rather doing it like this in a remote setting. And so as we began to think about our idea charrette process, we began to think, how could we take this in-person idea charrette that we had already developed and begin to transpose it into a virtual setting? In June of 2020, the George Floyd was murdered, and that seemed to be a very important and revolutionizing catalyst for idea work globally. Everyone, it seemed, wanted an idea strategic plan, wanted guidance on how to embed inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility inside of their organizations. Employees were clamoring and holding their employers accountable for embedding idea within their organizations to really begin to create more solutions and to begin to address racial systematic injustices. So this provided a very unique opportunity to begin to accelerate the idea charrette in a virtual setting. And that's just what we did. We began to template all of our charrette materials, our agendas, schedules, and activities. We began to reimagine how the activities that we had already built in person could be transposed from a virtual setting. We even began to reimagine how we collect data from a virtual standpoint versus in person. In-person idea charrette was really a great piloting effort, but it was all done around the cusp in the idea that we would have the ability to visit on site with organizations, that would be able to collect data, and that we'd be able to transpose that into on-hands activities. That no longer was the case beginning in 2020. And so we were at an important convergence of rethinking and reimagining what the idea charrette could look like from a virtual standpoint. So now I want to talk to you, if we can move to the next slide, about what an idea charrette process could look like, both in person and virtual. There's really three ways in which we adapted the charrette process for the development of an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility strategic planning process. One, we wanted to make sure that as part of the first step, that we can make sure that we are people ready. What people ready means is essentially preparing the necessary steps for the charrette participants to be prepared for the actual charrette once it arrives. This would mean making sure that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities, that they understood how to participate in the charrette itself, whether it be in person or virtual, and to make sure that they understood what the objectives and the structure and facilitation process would look like for them as they embark upon a 3-day idea charrette. The second step of an idea charrette process is to make sure that an organization is data ready. Data ready for us here really means that you want to make sure that you can have a strong understanding of what the inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility issues are inside of an organization in advance of going into a 3-day idea charrette. And this could include multiple points of data, perhaps having focus groups, maybe stakeholder interviews, maybe analyzing some of the data and themes that emerged from that process. Perhaps maybe you want to review some of your human resources or programmatic policy data information as well. But you don't have to feel you have to be limited by that. Really, the data that you collect as an organization can really span multiple areas. And so you really want to customize that process for you as an organization. The last step in the idea charrette is truly the culminating component, which is making sure that the organization gets themselves strategically ready. And this is the point in the process where you actually conduct a 3-day idea charrette, which allows us to really facilitate not only activities with internal, but also perhaps maybe external stakeholders as part of the process who are invited into this charrette. And now, each of these 3 days has a significant amount of embodied types of activities. Day 1 is typically held both from a virtual or in-person standpoint to give the charrette participants an opportunity to digest the information that they learned or collected as part of their data ready process. It could also be an opportunity for them to hold a number of meetings or to help kind of expose or invite others who are not participating in the charrette and engage them on what they think the vision from an organizational standpoint is for ideas. Now, the third day of the strategic for the third day of the idea charrette is really kind of encompassing the importance of making sure that you can actually build upon what you've done on day one, day two. The third day of a charrette is really about making sure that you can refine your burgeoning draft idea strategic plan, that you can get as much buy-in and collaboration as possible from the charrette participants, and perhaps maybe even those that are external as well, depending on how you structure it. Now, after your 3-day charrette has been completed, the really one of the most important steps is to make sure that you can finalize your idea strategy. And this can take anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks, or maybe just a little bit longer, depending on how much has been accomplished across the 3 days as part of the idea charrette process. Now, I'm going to turn over to Corey, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the idea charrette process.
Thanks, Sunilda. And for those of you who are watching and you have a particular question, feel free to drop it in the chat as we go, and we're happy to sort of pause and reflect on your inquiries. So again, within the organization of people ready, data ready, and strategy ready, from a people perspective, we're really thinking through all of the planning steps included and the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders and participants within the charrette. So some of the key questions that we always ask ourselves are from, what charrette participants are needed, right? Required versus optional. So typically within organizations, we like sort of the DEI function, so the head of DEI in that team, also the head of HR or the CHRO in that team. And then we also include additional stakeholders and stakeholder groups depending on the focus of the organization. So that could look like learning and development teams, that could look like marketing, advertising teams, that could look like finance teams. Really just conducting a stakeholder analysis at large to really understand the organization and who really needs to be participating to have a comprehensive and broad strategy. This also includes sort of the executive suite, the C-level suite, the senior leadership teams, etc., as they will also sort of come into play, not only to model dedication and commitment and investment in this, but also to make sure that the strategy that is defined can be sponsored and shepherded by them and ultimately owned. So which participants will be needed, all or part of the charrette time? So again, you'll see a schedule for that shortly, but ideally we like to have, sort of primary stakeholders, secondary stakeholders, and tertiary stakeholders, right? And each group, depending on where they fall, will be instrumental in, either answering, questions or providing data or, any additional information. Again, from the stakeholder analysis, we want to understand who needs to provide input, who needs to, approve, and then who needs to own. So we talked about the roles. Will there be different tiers of responsibilities for participants? I talked about the primary, secondary, and tertiary. Are the charrette participants diverse? So this is a sort of challenge that we did run into in regards to executive and C-level and senior leadership teams in regards to the clients that we worked with, given that, diversity, sort of a very broad term, but really sort of working to understand, a broad range of diverse identity markers. So that could be racial, racialized groups, ethnicity, nationality, it could be age, it could be gender, sexual orientation, ability. It could include a lot of different identity markers, and we really work to understand the identity markers of participants who were coming into the container of the charrette to really make sure that we were sort of activating inclusion across demographics and identities. We have question 6 here is external stakeholders being considered as part of the process. So with one of our organizations, and we'll talk about this, we did work to think about the community that this organization sat in and the benefactors of this organization to see if we could figure out how to incorporate their voice into the charrette. So while they may not have actively participated in the 3 days, we did work to gather their inputs prior to the strategy ready component so that we could include their voices. And then how best to collaborate around development of charrette objectives. We'll be talking a little bit about how we strung together the 3 days and the organization of those and how we work to sort of bring in voices at various times. So we'll be going through that. So each day's objective. So this is a super high level sort of visual, if you will, of each day's objectives when we brought folks together. So this is an actual visual of one that we conducted. It was in May, but we're using it to really illustrate how that first day is really about ideation, brainstorming, visioning. The second day is really, okay, now we're going to build, and then the third day is really for refining the draft, essentially. So you can see that, from an ideation and envision perspective, we're really bringing stakeholders together to understand the current state. So that's all from that data ready component. We've perhaps conducted focus groups, we've conducted interviews, we've in some cases administered a survey, like an engagement survey. We've also completed a programmatic review of an organization's data. So we really have a good idea of understanding both the infrastructure and the psychology of an organization, and we share that out with all the participants of the charrette. So that then lands us to, okay, to ideate on the future state. So if this is where we are, where do we want to go? Where are we headed? What do we want to commit to? How much are we going to bite off, right? And then we work to develop a vision for that. Given that we know where we are and we know where we're headed, what are the sort of, the steps for the roadmap or the path along the way? And then post day 1, we provide reflection, reading, and post assignment. So we will provide participants with reflection questions and likely also some thought leadership on the topic of DEI that may be industry specific or maybe something that's specific to whatever they're working on. And those are those post assignments. We want them to come in the next day with a lot of ideas on how to activate their vision. And of course, at the end of day 1, the charrette team is working to create the collateral for the next day. Then when we go into the very next day, this is where we really build. So we're going to review the idea vision that we identified on day 1. We're going to sort of kick the tires on that, add, affirm, adjust, and then we go into brainstorming. Okay, if this is our vision, where are we headed? What are we going to do? Let's brainstorm all the strategic objectives that we could conceivably think of. And then we start to dilute and filter and organize those strategic objectives throughout the whole end of the second day, where we identify quick wins, we identify long-term efforts, we identify impact versus effort, we identify resources, capacity, bandwidth, budget, all those sort of key items that are necessary. And then on day 3, where we go into the refinement, this is where we start to really sort of bring all of those data points to life. And this is after we've also already assigned another set of reflection questions and reading, so that folks coming into day 3 will be prepared and to not only review what has been created so far, but also be able to sort of add, affirm, and adjust what's been created. So then we go into data ready. So the data ready component, once we think about, people ready and think about the structure, data ready is, okay, now that we know who's going to participate, who needs to participate in the data gathering efforts? So who's going to be interviewed? Who's going to be included in the focus group? What questions are we going to ask? What questions do we need to ask? Do we need to go external? Do we need to invite, customers or community members into the charrette and hear their voices, as I described earlier? What is the demographic data of the organization? So this really looks at like workforce composition, when organizations are thinking on ways to diversify sort of either any level within the organization, either executive or senior level. or even just early in career, whatever level in the pyramid that they're working to, to sort of become more inclusive with and equitable, we will have that data as a preparatory effort so that in the charrette, everybody knows what the organization's current state is of that. And then what types of programmatic and or policy information. So here's where we issue a data request to the organization, and we ask them to provide information that is related to leadership, information that's related to their organizational strategy, information that's related to any preliminary DEI strategies that they have or culture strategies. They may themselves have administered an engagement survey either that year or prior, so we'll want to take that data into consideration. We may perhaps also need to administer our own signatory engagement survey. And then we may also want to get our hands on any programs, policies, and procedures that are essentially codified in the organization so we can review those from a peer perspective to really understand the opportunities to integrate equitable or more equitable practices depending on the maturity of the organization as part of this data ready component. Let's see. Excuse me. And so one of the things that we feel is most helpful in going into any strategy definition exercise, but particularly a charrette, is to really anchor in a framework to develop the strategy for, right? So when Zunilda and I created, or when Zunilda presented this opportunity to apply the charrette methods or the methods of charrette with strategy definition, we thought long and hard through what could a framework conceivably be. And that's what you're seeing here on the screen. We thought of all the entry points for diversity, equity, and inclusion within an organization comprehensively. And what I mean by entry points is where does diversity, equity, and inclusion intersect with organizational strategy or organizational operations. So this is where we looked at sort of from a leadership perspective, mission, vision, values, inclusive leadership behavior, data-informed decision-making, strategic challenges and opportunities for the organization. So for example, did they want to expand, their market share of diverse markets, or did they want to reach maybe their patient community better if they were a healthcare provider, or did they want to develop a new product if they were a consumer, a CNIP organization. So those are the sort of the entry points that we felt organizations could leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. From a culture perspective, we looked at the health and wellness of communication channels and vehicles, coaching and feedback, humanistic experience, and organizational structure. From a talent perspective, it's everything you might imagine in the talent lifecycle, from sourcing all the way to succession planning and departure. And then from a marketplace perspective, it's really looking at their, the brand, the perception of the employee value proposition, the shareholder and investor interest. We're seeing a lot of demand right now, particularly in ESG from shareholders and investors, demanding that organizations show and demonstrate a commitment to diversification of their workforce. And then also lastly, community and partnerships. So this isn't the sort of specific required framework that goes into sort of the methods of charrette, particularly for DEI, but we felt it was a helpful tool to provide organizations with that they could then sort of add, affirm, adjust, or provide feedback on what they think other elements of intersection for the organization would be. So it's just really helpful to have a framework in that way. And then lastly, strategy ready, right? So here is where we really want to work with the organization to think through, okay, we're going to ready you for strategy. We're going to use the methods of charrette. We're going to use a 3-day process that Zunilda, sort of reviewed. The output of this is going to be a draft strategy that's going to enable the organization to take ownership of it, to implement, integrate, execute, etc. And the key questions here are, what opportunities can we build to gather employees' preliminary vision of that strategy, right? Because we want to make sure we're capturing as much as possible. So, what other information needs to be gathered in efforts to design this strategy? How can we build connection and then transparency and internal alignment So one of the biggest utilities, I think, of the charrette process is really generating buy-in across all stakeholder groups. One of the hardest things I think that we find, Zunilda and myself and organizations, is really alignment around what the organization is going to undertake as a in relationship to inclusion, diversity, and equity. So it's really important to sort of capture the participation and contribution of all stakeholder groups really early in that data ready process, so that that can inform the strategy, because we want to generate, again, as much buy-in and alignment so that when we are in the charrette process, there's less sort of tension and friction on what the organization is going to do, because Zunilda and I, or in the charrette team, will reconcile all that feedback, provide a path for the organization to react to, so that sort of accelerates that alignment process. And then ultimately, who will be responsible for developing the final strategy post-charrette? So ultimately, those are your key stakeholders. Those are your, ideally, your project team in regards to the charrette. So ultimately, that looks like perhaps the leader of DE&I, the leader of HR, CHRO, etc. Oftentimes they work in combination. Sometimes they work in tandem. But ultimately, those are going to be your key stakeholder group to really take what has been defined and develop that one step further. And then, Zunilda, I believe I'm going to pass it over to you now to just walk through sort of super high level the charrette schedule.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. So just as Corey noted a few minutes ago, having stakeholder engagement is really an important component of the IDEA charrette process. And so I'm going to just walk through various elements that you may want to consider as you're building your own schedule for a 3-day IDEA charrette. As you can see from here, the 3-day charrette is really broken down across various modules of different types of activities that will allow us to engage different groups across the process. On day 1, as we kind of noted before, it's really about having a strong starting point of information relative to where an organization stands from a current state perspective around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And so oftentimes, as part of a kickoff process for the charrette, this can be a great opportunity to perhaps maybe do a download of some of the data that you collected as part of your data ready strategy steps that happened before the charrette. It could also be an opportunity to align around what the objectives of the charrette are. Perhaps maybe you might want to do some really fun and cool entry point bridging and bonding exercises in order to have the charrette participants engage pretty quickly at the outset of the charrette. Day 1 could also certainly include different modules of activities, everything from having some very high-level brainstorming sessions that happen within 60 or maybe 90-minute intervals, to actually also even perhaps maybe considering to invite external stakeholders into the process. This could be done through, for example, actually developing a built-in component of an open house as part of that process, where perhaps maybe you would gather employees or other external stakeholders as part of your charrette process. This could be board members, this could be maybe targeted groups that you interface and collaborate closely with as an organization, for example. But really, at the end of day 1, you really want to be asking yourself a couple of key questions as to where do you want this 3-day charrette to go? What does success look like at the end of the process? And what did we learn about our organization from an IDEA lens? That's really kind of the crux of what many of the activities will center on day 1. You can certainly also encourage additional participation with the charrette on day 1 by maybe having some assignments or readings, or perhaps maybe viewing videos to keep participants engaged, not only at the end of the day 1, but perhaps maybe as a primer for some of the work that they're going to do on day 2. Now, day 2 has a very different feel, and thus the activities and the framework around it will differ as well. Day 2 is all about rolling up your sleeves. It's about really beginning to brainstorm some of the types of activities and the tactics, and really where do we want our vision to look like, and who will be involved in that process. This is why it's so critical to make sure at the outset of a charrette planning process that you have the right players at the table and the right participants as part of the charrette. Now, because the charrette is a very iterative back and forth process of not only displaying information, having opportunity to brainstorm and dialogue around it, but also to certainly put forth particular solutions or maybe visioning as part of that process. It's so important to build out modules of time where you as a project team who actually helped the Charrette team kind of build out the schedule to make sure that you have enough time to absorb that feedback, iterate it, and bring it back forth to the Charrette participants. Now, this could be done through a variety of feedback loops, not only throughout day 2, but perhaps maybe even on day 3 as well. And the same thing for day 3. Day 3 is really going to be about refining your burgeoning draft IDEA strategic plan. So here you're going to take a lot of the feedback that you heard on day 2, a little bit of the information you got on day 1, and begin to kind of refine your IDEA strategic plan more. This could be done, again, through a variety of different feedback loops, maybe some discussion points as well. This could also be a really great and unique opportunity to circle back with some of those external stakeholders that you engaged on day 1 of the process by maybe having another open house opportunity or some space within your schedule where you can circle back on the progress you've made across 3 days of visioning with those stakeholders. This could be a unique opportunity for them not only to learn about the process that has taken shape to build the IDEA strategic plan, but also give them an opportunity to provide additional input and feedback as part of the process. Then, of course, as you begin to close out your 3-day charrette on day 3, you really want to have a lot of opportunity for self-reflection by the charrette participants, as well as the project team, and to give you all a great opportunity to also talk about next steps and who will take ownership of the IDEA strategic plan in draft form to really bring it over the finish line from a finalization standpoint. This could also be a great opportunity for the project team who's been kind of working hand in hand across several months in preparation for the charrette to kind of debrief on what some of the best practices or maybe lessons learned is part of the process. Now, just note, across this 3-day charrette, it's going to have a real back and forth feel to it, and it's going to move very rapidly. And the days may feel long. They might be whole 8-hour days truncated into smaller components or modules at a time that can span anywhere between 45 minutes or maybe 90 minutes. But I promise you, the output of this process is going to be one where everyone has an opportunity to kind of sit at the table to provide some input. There's an opportunity to also align around what we need to do next. What are the different resources that might be available? It could also be really great opportunities to kind of bond and build allyship across different groups within an organization, as well as with having leadership and employees really kind of align more strongly around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, along with obviously truncating the several month building of an IDEA strategic plan and truncating that down to almost just a couple of days worth of work. There are a lot of pluses to this process and a lot of great things and benefits as well. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the tools. There are a lot of them. And I want to make sure that you have a strong understanding of what are some of those tools that you can utilize as part of the charrette process across your 3 days. Well, certainly you can have a number of interactive exercises that you build out. You want to work in partnership with the charrette participants or at least a project team designated on behalf of the charrette to think through what will not only encourage active engagement by the charrette participants, but also kind of make sure that it stems in having the right types of outputs that you're going to need for the development of your draft strategic IDEA plan, as well as the finalization of that plan. You may even want to consider embedding some interviews and focus groups as part of the charrette process, either before or even perhaps maybe on day 1 as part of your efforts. You can also use as part of your charrette process, developing surveys to engage both internal and external stakeholders so you can begin to kind of gather some of that data that you'll need as part of the process. You certainly have heard a moment ago about the opportunity to use open house formats to really engage people in a really collective way. Again, you can do those in person as well as virtually. Polling, as we all know, is a really great way to also kind of tap into the pulse of how people are feeling and what they want to contribute as part of the process. In a virtual setting, making sure that we have the opportunity to use things such as whiteboard, chats, and even breakout room discussions are going to be really helpful to maintaining engagement. If you can imagine sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours straight, you want to engage folks pretty quickly around how to utilize different mechanisms as part of that process. And that's where whiteboards, chats, and even breakout room discussions can be really valuable. Certainly making sure that people stay engaged not only at the end of the day, but also in priming them for activities for the following day of activities as part of a charrette can really lend itself to having you do maybe some pre or post readings or maybe viewing videos as part of that process. So make sure you have all these tools as part of your toolbox and also reimagine others as well. Now, I certainly want to just give you a quick synopsis of an in-person case study that we did when we piloted actually our idea charrette. Is with a national museum, kind of in the early stages of identifying, clarifying their own strategy for diversity and inclusion that they wanted to make sure was not only built for their internal staff, but also was reflective of external members, visitors, as part of installation processes that they have. And it was really unique because the charrette had to really take into consideration not only the employees of the museum and its leadership and where they wanted to take diversity and inclusion to, but they also wanted to make sure the imprint was felt from an external standpoint by visitors and others who visited their museum. And so we were able to use the 3-day charrette in order to do that. And so the outcome of that process is that they were able to build a solution that could bridge and meet multiple stakeholders' interests as part of that by using an open house format to kind of invite employees to contribute to the development of their idea strategic plan, utilizing different departments within the museum as well as the museum's leadership in order to serve as participants as part of the charrette, but also making sure that they had the pulse of those externally, such as visitors, as part of the process and actually deployed surveys in order to obtain some of that information that was ultimately utilized as part of the 3-day charrette. And so this is just one example of how a charrette can be utilized in an in-person format using open houses, using tools such as videos, polling, and surveying, as well as stakeholder and focus group conversations in order to really tap into not only where diversity and inclusion sits from an employer and employee standpoint within a museum, but how will that be met by those who visited the museum? How will they be able to see diversity and inclusion come alive in their installations, in their events, in their activities? So with that, I want to turn it over to Corey, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about additional case studies.
Yeah, and Zunilda, I remember that charrette that you did for the museum and just how invested and participatory they were. I think your open house had like 50 people or 75 people. Was that true?
It was about actually 100 people that attended.
Oh, oh
It was a
wow. Yeah, I just yeah.
it was 100 employees, so it was really well attended. We were anticipating only about 25 employees, and so when 100 showed up, we considered that a good thing.
Yeah, that was a great thing. And I remember seeing all the pictures and just all the robust that work that came out of that. And there was a lot of post work as well that came out of that from a strategy refinement perspective. After the charrette, they, I think, wanted you to come back and do more craft more of that strategy for them. So that's really cool. So yeah, what we're going to talk about next is just a global automotive manufacturer. Was actually located here in California, where I sit. They wanted to understand the enablers and barriers of organizational culture through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and use that information to inform an organizational strategy that could help them advance and really kind of actualize, stand up some early efforts in DEI. So, from a data ready and people ready perspective, we absolutely presented the model. We conducted a stakeholder analysis. We administered some focus groups. We conducted some interviews. I think we administered a survey even, and also reviewed the programmatic data. So we had a lot of information that we packaged up and presented to them on day one. And that just led to absolute robust discussion. The CEO participated. The CHRO, I believe, or the head of talent, was the one that brought us in that commenced this work. It was very well attended, and it was one of those charrettes, I guess, that just from like start to finish or end to end was almost seamless. There was like no hiccups, and everything worked well, and everybody was on board. And And I think that's because we generated so much early buy-in with their executive team through interviews, through focus groups, really working to capture what they felt, their experiences, their observations, where they felt there was, sort of low-hanging fruit or, early, successful initiatives, potential successful initiatives, and then what would be maybe more longer term where the organization would struggle more or be challenged more to implement. So it was really helpful to do a lot of that data gathering early, so that on day one of the charrette, we were able to sort of say, okay, here's where you are and where do you want to go. And then the other one was just a national outdoor lifestyle products manufacturer, where they also very similarly wanted to understand the current state of their talent infrastructure and employee sentiment on culture in efforts to also stand up a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So very much like the automotive manufacturer that I mentioned, we, from a data gathering perspective, conducted focus groups, interviews, administered a survey, etc. This one had a little bit more challenge in trying to involve the executive team. So when we talk about that buy-in and the importance of really having them on board early, this was a little bit more sort of challenging, just because the executives and leaders themselves were at different points of maturity in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some were sort of unaware, and some were extreme advocates. And so really trying to bring them to the table, leveraging the charrette model for 3 days to really sort of understand the current state. We did in the end develop a strategy for them, but it did not come. Day 2 was very challenging in trying to align leaders in regards to bringing them along. So, not every charrette's going to move along without a hitch, but this was still, in and of itself successful, given that we did complete it. They got their draft, but, sometimes it's, the experience of it can sometimes be challenging, just depending on where leaders fall on their own maturity and understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's just something that we'll leave you with. And honestly, I think we're coming up to the end of the presentation, so I'd really love to be able to get some questions. But lastly, some of our lessons learned: it's important to engage stakeholders early and often in the charrette process, also given the illustration that we just provided. Virtual charrettes require more activities of engagement across the whole day. I will tell you, virtual charrettes are very promising. Obviously, everybody, because of the pandemic and the consequence of the pandemic, we've all gotten used to virtual, but it does come with just more rigor and more intentional focus on how to engage people, how to keep people interested, how to keep people thinking. Across 3 days, it can be a long time. Day 1 should include a recap of alignment on what was learned from the review of data. Again, really working to say, okay, does everybody agree of where we are? Does everybody understand where we are, why we're here, what, sort of the indicators are, what's driving our either success or challenges in the organization? A need for longer design studio times between major modules on day 2 and day 3. Yes. Initially, I think we had some long nights trying to figure out how to reconcile all the notes that were taken verbatim from both day 1 and day 2. We did get good at it, and we'll probably even get better at it the more charrettes that we conduct. But yeah, at first there was like, oh gosh. And so what that indicated was we actually needed a larger team to be able to conduct the charrette. Because Zunilda and I first tried to do it ourselves, and that was just not ideal, I think we learned. So priming activities, homework assignments, definitely, I think, pre-reads, reflections, thought leadership, really trying to prime participants with as much information as possible prior to even, commencing this process is important. And then lastly, facilitator guides, especially for folks who are really new into facilitating and may not have sort of, the experience or the exposure or, or the certification from that the Charrette Institute offers. Definitely really giving folks, preparing the facilitators. So I recognize we have a question. I think, let's see, Mila. So good to see you. I'm so glad you're enjoying this. What are some criteria for identifying whether a client is prepared for the undertaking of an IDEA charrette? I can see there being a lot of interest in the outcomes, but how can you ensure a client stakeholders can fully participate, contribute, and lead the efforts of the strategy after the completion of day 3? So yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. But Zunilda, do you have a perspective?
I do, but you go first.
Well, I mean, I was just gonna say, we typically don't like assess individuals before we commence the process or the methods of charrette in working to, define a strategy. We know that every participant in an organization is not going to be at the same point in time on sort of their own learning continuum or their own maturity in this way. Um, I think early on when you when you conduct the stakeholder analysis and then conduct interviews, you kind of get a sense of where the points of contention in an organization might be, or you get a sense of the resistance and where that might live, or the challenges and where those might emerge. And so I think those are lends itself to the facilitators preparing themselves in some way to the challenges or tensions that might emerge, or the conflict even that might emerge, particularly as you start to define. Um, and so I don't think that there is a way to really assess clearly, or to even mandate that everybody be on the same page. So it's really just more preparatory work on making sure that the facilitator is prepared to navigate those conflicts and things as they come. Yeah. Zunilda?
Yeah, and I think you're right on with that. I think particularly, from the clients that I have saw where it was more successful perhaps maybe than others was in fact when you could see some general alignment at the leadership team level around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. If there is some friction or non-alignment in that particular area, as you begin to invite them into the process, you oftentimes will see red flags appear pretty quickly. And obviously, as a facilitator, you need to be able to manage that. But I do note that at least seeing that early on is usually a good predictor as to whether they'll be ready for all of the full components of an idea charrette, particularly because as you begin to kind of navigate through the preparatory planning process, which could take several weeks or even a couple of months before you actually get to the charrette, that can oftentimes give you a good sense as to how ready they might be. I think another thing that could be an interesting predictor is the level of data that you're able to collect at the outset of the process. I oftentimes found that when there's very little data that the organization itself is kind of holding, chronicling, inventorying, if you will, that's oftentimes a good predictor too that there might be difficulties as you kind of continue to move along the planning process for the idea charrette, and even in how you conduct the idea charrette. You'll need to think a bit more creatively about how to actually pull that data together as part of the planning process for the idea charrette. So the more that they have that up front, that's usually a really great thing. If they're struggling to even provide you some of that data, or are not at the capacity where they even collect that kind of information, that will then put some of the onus on the facilitator of the idea charrette, or perhaps the project team, in order to compile that. And so that's another thing that can serve as a bit of a red flag quickly as to whether it will be more successful than not. But I definitely agree, there isn't a fine and fast list that can kind of predict whether an organization is truly ready for idea charrette. Even if they have some challenges, I would actually argue that they probably really do need to go through a charrette process, because really the candidness and the beauty of the charrette process is to bring different perspectives and thoughts to the table, even that conflict with one another. Because if you can have those breakthrough moments, and I've seen it firsthand when organizations will come into the idea charrette really not aligned at all. And through the 3 days, there's been like changes that we see within the conversations, how people interact and engage with one another. And so even if you don't have all of the components kind of fully fleshed out at the end of the idea charrette, that process that they went through might actually create a template for them to utilize as they move out of the charrette process. Because ultimately, we're putting together an idea strategic plan, but it's really going to take multiple stakeholders to help implement it. And so some organizations will have an easier time to do that if they have more stronger alignment at the beginning. But even if they don't, the idea charrette might be a very unique tool to kind of get them there closer. So that's how I would kind of just add some additional context to that.
Yeah, and Zunilda, we have a question from Tatiana Thomas. Hello, Tatiana, about how to determine the specific number of participants involved in strategy building. And I think what you just described regarding the implementation, certainly owners of implementing the strategy need to be involved. And so that is going to be as comprehensive as the strategy sort of evolves. You'll want those owners. So in the example of the National Museum, they wanted to really create a strategy that was specific for employees, members, and even artists and their installations, right? And customers who visit, visitors of the museum. And so, the particular owners of all those functional areas would need to be present and involved in, creating the strategy. So it's really dependent on sort of the organizational structure. And then I would say it's also dependent on the framework and the framework for the strategy that you use. So in the example that we provided, the leadership, culture, talent, and marketplace, there are certain entry points. And so each of those entry points typically has an owner within the organization, and so those are the folks that you would want to involve. And I think we have time for one more question, if there is. Holly says, Corey, you alluded to the wealth of data that you had to process during the charrette. Can you and Zunilda talk about what an ideal number of the team would be and what kind of roles they would have? Zunilda, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So I think, when we're talking about sort of the planning process, right, to kind of build the 3-day charrette, you really want to make sure that you have a relatively small but manageable team that's kind of starting the process of planning the charrette process. And so there's no magic number, but, when you think about sort of smaller teams of 3 to 5 are probably in a good space. You don't want to have a team of 20 people kind of planning a charrette. You want it to be kind of on the smaller end so that it could be nimble and that they can be serving as points of contact for the organization as needed. So really the ideal number of participants that actually participate in the charrette itself really can vary. In some instances, some idea charrettes had participants of about 10, others had as many as 30. I think as you go beyond sort of that number, you really have to think about perhaps maybe expanding the number of days the charrette is, because you want to make sure that you can allot enough time for everyone to really participate in a pretty healthy way. And so when you start kind of ballooning to 40 or 50 or 60 people, right, that's great in terms of a number, but that probably will not be manageable across a 3-day format. You may need to actually think about kind of expanding beyond the 3-day format, which is totally fine. The traditional planning charrette process actually stems between 3 to 5 days. So it's definitely doable, but you just need to be cognizant of, the number of participants during the charrette and how many days that you really want to make sure you can align to that number group. So that's something that I would just kind of note. I think particularly when we're thinking about the role of sort of the project team inside of an organization that's going to be part of the process of planning, all the logistical pieces, the schedules, developing the agenda, things like that. You want to make sure that you can have important leads on the team and then those that can serve in support roles as well. Having a lot of hands in the pot, so to speak, could be a good thing when it comes to the charrette, but you want to make sure it's done in a very strategic manner so that everyone understands what their role is. Doing preparatory sessions before the charrette with the project team are really crucial to the success of a 3-day idea charrette. So you don't want to kind of just show up on day one without facilitation prep in any kind of way. You really want to make sure that you understand who's going to do the pass-offs, who's going to do various activities and elements that are centered around the schedule of the charrette. And so you want to have strong alignment about that before the charrette is conducted, so that if you need to adjust or perhaps you need to bring in more people to support that, you can. And again, that's all preparatory around the number of participants for the charrette, which can be totally customizable depending on the organization.
Do you have any follow-up stories on the case studies?
Particularly one of the case studies where we kind of mentioned the National Outdoor Lifestyle Manufacturer. They've actually done some really great work since the time that we conducted the virtual IDEA charrette. They were able to successfully develop their IDEA strategic plan and began to immediately implement it. One of the chief kind of recommendations coming out of that process was really the need to have an overarching IDEA strategic vision statement, as well as hiring of resources to support the implementation of the IDEA strategic plan. And they did that actually immediately within 3 months. They had someone that they had hired who was really in charge of implementation of the strategic plan. I know I've seen them on LinkedIn doing some good work and getting some great awards in terms of kind of organization, which is heavily dominated by males, male-dominated industry. So we've heard definitely some good stuff that has emerged since that time when we've done work with them. But I don't know if Corey have some other great stories, but that one really stands out for me, in part because that was a client that actually had really great buy-in and engagement from their leadership team at the outset of the IDEA charrette. And so it didn't really surprise me how quickly they moved after as a result of that, because they were able to have sort of budget and resources in place in order to begin that movement of recommendations around what to kind of do to kind of embed inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility inside of their organization. And they had gender particularly as a really standout issue for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say both with the National Museum, I know that they were working hard to implement their strategy, and as an outcome from our work with them, they actually had us partner with other museums that they were affiliated with to also conduct charrettes for. And so the National Museum was part of a chain of museums nationally that then worked to think through how to really particularly focus on the diversification of installations and really representing sort of more underrepresented voices in regards to art in museums. And so that was a big lever, I think, more than the internal focus that they applied as a consequence of the charrette. I think they really started to double down on efforts to really think about how to recognize more underrepresented artists in their installations. So that was an outcome of that work. And then from the global automobile manufacturer, the North American segment of that organization actually commissioned us to work exclusively for the North American focus. But I know as a consequence of that work, they took this initiative on more globally. So, and also to Zunilda's point, they were not prepared for the comprehensiveness of what they had developed from a strategic perspective. So I think first they had to be like, okay, we need resources for this. We need both headcount and budget. And so how do we get that? And so they after they developed this strategy, which they were very appreciative for, they crawled before they could walk. But yeah, I do know that they have a head of DE&I now for this work and are executing their strategy. And it's likely also gone through its iteration since then as well. But I do know that they're doing that.